The sun was a tyrant. It beat down on the cracked earth of the Fort Gannon training ground, baking the dust into a fine, choking powder. It bleached the olive-drab paint on the metal obstacles and shimmered in cruel waves above the gravel, making the air itself seem to warp and groan under the strain. For the 100-odd recruits standing in loose, exhausted formations, this sun was a physical enemy, second only to the infamous obstacle course that loomed before them like the skeleton of some great, slain beast. They called it the Goliath, and today, Goliath was winning. Amidst this world of sweat, shouted orders, and clanging metal, there was a ghost. Her name was Evelyn Reed, though few knew it. To most, she was simply the janitor. At 22, she possessed a quiet, unassuming beauty that was easily overlooked, sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that held a deep stillness, and a complete absence of makeup. She moved through the periphery of this hyper-masculine world in a faded gray jumpsuit with the word custodial ghosted across the back, pushing a rattling cleaning cart that was as much a part of her as her own shadow. She was an unperson, a piece of the scenery meant to be looked through, not at. Her movements were economical and deliberate, a study in quiet efficiency. The sweep of her broom left clean arcs in the dust. The wipe of her rag erased the grime of exertion from tables and benches. She was the silent reset button at the end of each punishing day. On this particular afternoon, the air was thick, not just with heat, but with frustration. One by one, recruits had thrown themselves at the Goliath, and one by one, the Goliath had thrown them back, bruised and humbled. The final obstacle, a 12-foot vertical wall, stood pristine and unconquered. As Evie pushed her cart past the bleachers, a low whistle cut through the air. It was Bryce, a wiry recruit with a laugh that grated like sandpaper on stone. He was leaning against a post, trying to catch his breath, but not too tired for a cheap shot. "Hey, janitor," he called out, his voice carrying easily. "After you mop up our sweat, come shine our boots." A ripple of laughter went through the nearby group. His friend Landon, a stocky kid with slicked back hair and a grin that screamed entitlement, elbowed him. "Yeah, I've got some extra mud for you right here." He stomped a heavy boot, dislodging a clump of dirt that landed near the wheel of her cart. Evie didn't flinch. Her gaze didn't waver from the path ahead. She stopped, bent down with a fluid grace that was entirely out of place, and swept the dirt clod into her dustpan. She said nothing. Her silence was a void, and in a place filled with noise, silence was unsettling. The lack of reaction only goaded them on. Sergeant Decker, a broad-shouldered man whose authority was his entire identity, was pacing the edge of the course, his face a thundercloud of disappointment. He spotted Evie, and his scowl deepened. "This isn't your place, custodial," he barked, his voice a drill instructor's roar. "This is where soldiers compete. Step aside." He didn't see a person. He saw an interruption, an anomaly in his ordered world. Evie simply adjusted the angle of her cart and continued on her path, creating a wider berth around the men. She was adept at making herself smaller, at navigating the spaces left for her by bigger, louder people. The recruits, however, were not finished. Their own failures on the course had left a bitter taste in their mouths, and she was an easy target to vent their frustrations upon. As she passed a cluster of them, a lanky recruit tossed an empty water bottle toward her cart. It clattered against the metal frame before rolling into the dust. Again, Evie stopped. She picked up the bottle and dropped it into the trash bag tied to her cart. Her movements were slow, precise, as if she were giving them a moment to reconsider. They didn't take it. The final failure of the day belonged to a promising recruit who slipped on the ropes and had to be helped off the course. A collective groan of defeat went through the platoon. Captain Monroe, a lean man who seemed permanently attached to a clipboard, sighed theatrically. He was a man who enjoyed the small dramas of training, the little tests of ego. His eyes, sweeping over the defeated recruits, landed on Evie, who was now quietly wiping down a nearby water fountain. A slow, provocative smile spread across his face. He strolled over, his boots kicking up little clouds of dust. "Well, gentlemen," he announced to the platoon, though his eyes were fixed on Evie. "It seems the Goliath has bested our finest. Perhaps we've been going about this all wrong." He paused for dramatic effect. The recruits turned, following his gaze. He gestured with his clipboard toward the silent janitor. "What do you say, custodial?" His tone was half joking, half challenging. "You're here every day. You've seen how it's done. Want to give it a try?" The question hung in the blistering air, absurd and insulting. A few recruits snickered. The snickers grew into open laughter. The idea was preposterous. This slight, silent woman in a baggy jumpsuit against the very course that had broken them all day. It was the perfect comic relief to a humiliating afternoon. Landon roared, slapping Bryce on the back, already picturing her stumbling over the first log. Evie finished wiping the fountain. She placed the rag back in its designated bucket on her cart and slowly turned. She didn't look at the laughing recruits. She looked only at Captain Monroe, her dark eyes steady and unreadable. The laughter began to falter under that unwavering gaze. The air grew thick, charged with the weight of her silence. Captain Monroe had expected a flustered refusal, a shy shake of the head, perhaps even tears. He had not expected this. A calm, assessing silence that seemed to strip away his rank and his sarcasm, leaving him feeling strangely exposed. "Well?" he pressed, trying to regain control of the moment. "Cat got your tongue?" Evie's hands rested on the handle of her cart. Her fingers curled slightly, the only sign of any internal reaction. "You're serious?" she asked. Her voice was low, devoid of emotion, yet it carried with perfect clarity across the silent yard. "As serious as a heart attack," Bryce chimed in, his confidence returning. "Go on, show us how the pros do it." Kendra, a female recruit with manicured nails and a sneer she didn't bother to hide, stepped forward. She thrived on being the center of attention, especially at another's expense. "Oh, sweetie, you're embarrassing yourself," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness loud enough for everyone to hear. "This isn't a game for people like you. Why don't you stick to cleaning?" The crowd, emboldened by Kendra's cruelty, began to chant, a low and mocking rhythm. "Do it, do it, do it." Evie's gaze shifted from Monroe to the course, her eyes tracing the path from the starting pole to the final unconquered wall. She seemed to be measuring it, not with fear, but with a kind of detached familiarity, like a carpenter sizing up a piece of wood. Then she looked back at Monroe. "I've done it," she said, her voice still quiet, but now infused with a steel that made the air crackle. "Many times." For a full second, the chanting stuttered. The sheer, unexpected confidence in her words was a shock to the system. Then Bryce broke the spell, doubling over with his hyena laugh. "Oh man, she's serious," he gasped, wiping tears of mirth from his eyes. "She thinks mopping the barracks is the same as running the course." And the laughter returned, louder and more vicious this time, a collective release of their own insecurities. But not everyone was laughing. Near the edge of the crowd, a quiet recruit named Caleb clutched a notebook, his brow furrowed. He had been watching Evie all morning, noticing the efficiency of her movements, the way she never wasted a step. He saw something the others didn't. Captain Monroe, caught up in the spectacle he had created, gestured to a pile of spare uniforms. "If you're playing, you wear the uniform," he said, his voice harder now. "No exceptions." He tossed her an oversized BDU shirt and trousers. The green fabric swallowed her small frame. She slipped them on over her jumpsuit, the sleeves flapping past her wrists, the pants pooling at her ankles. Before she could even tie the drawstring, Bryce and Landon crept up behind her with exaggerated stealth, tugging at the loose ties, loosening them further. "Look at that," Landon snickered to his friends. "She'll trip before she hits the 5-meter mark." Evie knelt, ignoring them, and began to methodically retie the uniform, securing the pant legs at her ankles and rolling the sleeves with a crisp, practiced motion. As she did, another recruit, a burly guy with a chipped front tooth, leaned in close, his breath hot with coffee. "You're wasting our time," he said. "This course isn't for charity cases." He dropped a crumpled soda can at her feet. The crowd chuckled, feeding off his bravado. Evie's fingers paused on the ties. Her jaw tightened, a subtle shift that only a keen observer would notice. She picked up the can, dropped it into her trash bag, and stood to face him. "Time is only wasted if you're not learning," she said, her voice even, her eyes locked on his. He took an involuntary step back, his bravado flickering. The crowd's laughter thinned. She finished securing the uniform, her expression unreadable. She brushed the dirt from her knees and stepped toward the starting line. Her rubber-soled janitor's shoes scuffed the ground, a soft, unassuming sound against the heavy thud of the recruits' combat boots. The laughter grew sharper again, a desperate attempt to reaffirm their own superiority in the face of this strange, quiet defiance. But her walk, straight-backed, unhurried, changed the air. It felt like the unnerving calm before a storm, a gathering of forces they couldn't see or understand. She was no longer a ghost. She was a presence. At the starting line, the final, most humiliating condition was presented. It came from Coach Slade, a visiting SEAL instructor with a face like granite and arms crossed like twin pythons over his chest. He had been watching the entire exchange with a cold, analytical eye. "If you're so sure, Janitor," he said, his voice a low growl, "do it blindfolded." And the proposition was so outrageous, so cruelly absurd, that it sent a jolt of ecstatic energy through the crowd. This was better than they could have imagined. Now, her failure wouldn't just be a stumble. It would be a complete and total humiliation, a story they would tell for weeks. Landon eagerly handed her a black strip of cloth, his smirk back in full force. "Good luck," he said, the words dripping with mockery. Phones were raised, cameras ready to capture the inevitable fall. As Evie took the blindfold, Caleb, the quiet recruit, pushed through the edge of the crowd. He stumbled, almost tripping over his own feet. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice soft, almost drowned out by the noise. For the first time that afternoon, Evie's expression softened. She looked at him, a flicker of acknowledgement in her dark eyes. "I know," she said. Then she turned away and tied the blindfold, pulling it tight with steady, certain hands. She stood at the line, head slightly tilted, as if listening to something no one else could hear: the wind, the feel of the packed earth beneath her shoes, the internal map of the course she had committed to memory. The whistle blew, a shrill, piercing sound that seemed to signal the start of a joke. And then she moved. It wasn't a run, it was a flow. She didn't sprint wildly into the unknown. Her first steps were measured, her hands reaching out and finding the first wooden pole with an unnerving precision. There was no hesitation. Her hands found the grips, her feet found the footholds. She was up and over in a single, fluid motion. The laughter died in Bryce's throat. She reached the balance beam. The recruits had struggled with it all day, arms flailing. Evie's feet hit the exact center of the beam. She moved across it with the certainty of someone walking down a hallway in her own home, her arms held loosely at her sides. The crowd's cheers faded to whispers. She hit the rope swing. Her hands found the course rope, her body arcing through the air. She landed on the other side in a soft thud of dust, already moving toward the next obstacle, the low crawl under barbed wire. She slithered through the tunnel with a reptilian grace, her oversized uniform never snagging. The whispers died completely. The only sounds were the rasp of her breathing and the scuff of her shoes on the obstacles. The phones were still raised, but their owners had forgotten they were filming. They were simply watching, transfixed. Captain Monroe's clipboard hung limp at his side. Sergeant Decker's mouth was slightly agape. Coach Slade's arms had uncrossed, and he leaned forward, his granite expression cracked with disbelief. She reached the final wall, the 12-foot behemoth that had been their collective shame. It had broken stronger, taller, more muscular soldiers than anyone present. For the first time, Evie paused for a single, deep breath. The entire base seemed to hold its breath with her. She took 3 running steps. She leaped. It was not a scramble. It was an ascent. Her hands caught the top edge, her fingers finding purchase as if they had known the splintered wood their entire lives. Her body swung up in one smooth, powerful arc, a feat of pure kinetic poetry. She was over the top and gone. She landed on the other side. The blindfold, jostled by the final leap, slipped down, hanging loosely around her neck. A stopwatch in Coach Slade's hand clicked. He stared at it, then at the wall, then back at the watch. 87 seconds. The old record, set by a legendary Special Forces operator 5 years prior, was over 3 minutes. Evie stood on the other side of the wall, her breathing steady, her face calm. It was as if she had just finished a routine chore, not shattered every expectation and rewritten the history of the course. The silence that followed was louder, heavier, and more profound than any cheer had ever been. It was the sound of 100 arrogant assumptions turning to dust. Evie walked back toward her cart, her steps as even and unhurried as they had been before. The crowd parted for her, a silent, stunned sea of green uniforms. No one dared to meet her eyes. They looked at their boots, at the ground, anywhere but at the small woman in the janitor's shoes who had just dismantled their reality. But the ego, once wounded, often lashes out in its death throes. As Evie passed, Kendra stepped forward again, her face a mask of furious disbelief. "Cute trick," she spat, her voice sharp with venom. "But it doesn't make you one of us." And Evie stopped, her hand resting on the cart's handle. She turned just enough to meet Kendra's eyes. "I don't need to be," she said. The words were quiet, but they hit like a physical blow, leaving Kendra's face flushed with red. The spell of silence was broken, but not with awe. It was broken by the sputtering rage of Sergeant Decker. He could not accept this. It was a violation of the natural order of things. "No way," he growled, stomping forward, his face beet red. She cheated. Someone must have guided her. Signals. Landon, desperate to cling to any explanation that didn't involve his own glaring misjudgment, nodded eagerly. "Check her shoes," he said, pointing a trembling finger. "I bet she's got some kind of device in there. A receiver." The accusation was pathetic, but it was something to hold on to. Evie stopped again. She turned fully to face them, her expression not angry, but weary. "Go ahead," she said, her voice so steady it made Landon flinch. She kicked off her worn, rubber-soled shoes and tossed them onto the dirt in front of him. They landed with a soft puff of dust. Decker snatched them up, turning them over and over, shaking them violently, peeling back the insoles. He found nothing but dust, worn rubber, and the faint smell of bleach. He stood there, empty-handed, the useless shoes, a symbol of his own foolishness. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some recruits now looked at Decker and Landon with a new expression, contempt. As the sergeant stood frozen in his humiliation, a tall man stepped out from the shade of the command building. He was Colonel Hawthorne, the base commander, a man with graying temples and a face that gave nothing away. He had been watching the entire spectacle, his hands clasped behind his back. The recruits instinctively straightened up, their attention snapping toward him. Hawthorne walked forward at a measured pace, his presence commanding immediate silence. He didn't look at Decker or the recruits. He looked at Evie, and for the first time that day, someone looked at her with something that resembled respect. He stopped in the middle of the yard, his voice calm, but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "Do any of you know who used to hold the blindfolded record on the Goliath?" Confused silence. No one answered. "His name was Master Sergeant Thorne," Hawthorne continued, his eyes sweeping over the sea of blank faces, a legend in the special operations community. "He set the record 5 years ago. It was considered unbreakable." He paused, letting the weight of that information settle. Then he turned his gaze slowly, deliberately, toward Evie, who was calmly slipping her shoes back on. "Do you know who mops the floors in the barracks here?" he asked, his voice dropping slightly. The recruits turned, a dawning, horrified understanding beginning to flicker in their eyes. "Former Air Force Special Operations Combat Controller, Evelyn Reed," Hawthorne stated, the words landing like hammer blows. "The one who trained Master Sergeant Thorne, the one whose unofficial record he spent 2 years trying to break and never could." A collective, silent gasp went through the platoon. Bryce's laugh died in his throat. Landon's phone, which he had been clutching, disappeared into his pocket. Kendra stared at the ground as if wishing it would swallow her whole. The world had just been turned upside down. The ghost in the gray jumpsuit was not a ghost at all. She was a giant. Evie finished tying her shoes and straightened up, adjusting the handle of her cart. Her face remained unchanged. She looked at the stunned crowd, at the humbled sergeant, at the commanding officer, and offered a simple, devastatingly modest statement. "I just clean now," she said, "but I never forget the course." "Oh." And with that, she turned and pushed her cart away, its wheels rattling softly on the gravel, leaving a trail of shattered pride and profound silence in her wake. The next morning, Fort Gannon was a different place. The air was still hot, the dust still rose in clouds, but the oppressive atmosphere of casual cruelty had evaporated. It was replaced by something else, a quiet, uncertain tension. When Evelyn Reed pushed her cart past the barracks, no one whistled. No one threw bottles. The recruits parted for her, some standing a little straighter, their eyes fixed forward, as if her passing were a formal inspection. As she passed the mess hall, Bryce, the wiry instigator, caught her eye. He looked down at his boots, then back up, his face flushed. "Hey," he mumbled, the sound barely audible. Sorry, about yesterday." Evie gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, nothing more, and kept moving. The apology was acknowledged, but not necessarily accepted. The lesson was not about forgiveness. It was about change. By noon, a single slip of paper had been pinned to the main bulletin board, right next to the weekly training schedule. In neat, black ink, it read, "Never underestimate the one mopping the floor. They might have once commanded you on the battlefield." Nobody saw who put it there. Nobody needed to. Recruits read it in silence, some lingering longer than others, the words a mirror reflecting their own foolishness. The consequences, like ripples in a pond, began to spread. That afternoon, Sergeant Decker received a call from command. Those standing nearby saw the color drain from his face as he listened, his only response a series of clipped, "Yes, sir." By evening, he was packing his gear, reassigned to a desk job at a supply depot in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. Hazing and unprofessional conduct were the official reasons. No one said Evie's name, but they all knew. Landon's reckoning came via the court of public opinion. A clip of him mocking Evie, filmed by another recruit, had found its way online. It went viral, juxtaposed with news of her incredible feat. His social media was flooded with comments calling him a bully. By the end of the week, a local gym chain that had sponsored him with free merchandise quietly dropped his name from their ads. His entitlement had finally met a world that wasn't impressed. Jenkins, the lanky recruit who had tossed the water bottle, was dropped from the program a week later, failing the course one too many times. His confidence, built on a flimsy foundation of arrogance, had been shattered, and he couldn't recover. It wasn't revenge. It was simply the world balancing itself out. Evie never spoke of it. She didn't need to. She continued her work with the same quiet dignity as always. One evening, as she swept the supply shed, the old maintenance worker, Silas, limped over. He was a man of few words, his hands permanently stained with grease. "You did good out there, kid," he said, his voice rough but warm. Evie paused her sweeping and looked up. "Just doing my job, Silas," she replied. Silas grinned, a network of wrinkles deepening around his eyes. "Some jobs are more important than others." He gave her a wink and limped away, whistling softly. It was a brief moment of connection between two people who understood the value of quiet, essential work. The recruits started to see her differently. They didn't know her whole story, but they could feel its weight. They saw it in the way she tied her hair back in a simple, no-nonsense ponytail, in the way her hands gripped a mop handle as if they had once gripped something far heavier. They saw it in her silence, which was no longer the silence of weakness, but the heavy, profound silence of truth. One afternoon, as she cleaned the bleachers, a recruit named Harper, a tall woman with a determined jaw, approached her. "I want to try it," she said, her voice steady but nervous. "Blindfolded." Evie looked up from her work, wiping her hands on her jumpsuit. "Then practice," she said simply. "Know the course better than you know yourself." Harper nodded, her jaw tight with resolve, and walked back toward the course, her steps purposeful. The ripple was no longer just about regret. It was becoming about inspiration. Days turned into weeks. The training ground changed. The brutal, unrelenting nature of the Goliath remained, but now it had a new name whispered among the recruits: Reed's Course. No one broke her record. No one came close. It stood as a monument to their misjudgment and a testament to a standard they now aspired to. The culture of the base settled into a new rhythm. The recruits trained harder, their eyes sharper, as if they were looking for the hidden strength in everyone around them. The casual cruelty was gone, replaced by a grudging, hard-won respect, not just for rank, but for character. One evening, a black SUV, its tires crunching on the gravel, rolled onto the base. It stopped near the supply shed where Evie was finishing her work for the day. The door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and moved with a quiet, powerful grace that made the air itself seem to shift. He wore civilian clothes, but his posture, his walk, the way he surveyed his surroundings, it all spoke of a man who had seen things these recruits could only read about in field manuals. The few recruits who were lingering outside froze. Captain Monroe, walking by, straightened his back, his clipboard suddenly tight in his hands. The man walked straight to the shed where Evie was stacking mops. He leaned against the doorway, watching her. She glanced up, and a small, genuine smile touched her lips. She finished her task, locked the shed door, and walked out to meet him. Whispers spread like wildfire. Her husband, Marcus. former Delta commander. The names were spoken with a mixture of awe and fear. Landon, who happened to be nearby, looked away, his face pale. Bryce fidgeted with his hands in his pockets. Marcus wrapped an arm around Evie's shoulders, and they walked to the SUV. He didn't say a word to anyone. He didn't need to. His presence was a quiet, final statement. They drove off, leaving the base quieter than it had been in weeks. But as they left, Caleb, the quiet recruit with the notebook, stood by the fence watching. He opened his notebook, wrote something down, and closed it. His face was set with a new kind of determination. The note on the bulletin board stayed up, its edges curling in the heat. Recruits still stopped to read it, letting the words sink in. A few days later, a new recruit, a kid barely 19 with wide, nervous eyes, approached Evie as she locked up the shed. "Ma'am," he began, then stopped, unsure if that was the right word. "I heard what you did, on the course. I want to be that good someday." Evie looked at him, her dark eyes steady. "Then don't talk about it," she said, her voice, not unkind, but firm. "Do it." The kid nodded, his face serious, and walked away as if he'd been given a mission. That was her final lesson. Her cart kept moving, her hands kept working, but the base was not the same. It was quieter, sharper, as if it had learned something it could not unlearn. For in that place of dust and steel, a modern fable had been written. It was a story not of a hero who shouted, but of one who was silent. It was a reminder that true strength isn't measured by the uniform you wear or the volume of your voice, but by the quiet dignity you hold in a world that tries to make you small. And that the most profound changes often begin not with a bang, but with the soft, steady rattle of a janitor's cart.